Some women bloom late because the world never gave them sunlight until their hair turned silver. At 42, Claraboon had long given up the illusion that love would come wrapped in lace and laughter. The years had carved quiet hollows into her spirit, slow and invisible, like wind eroding canyon walls. She was not a woman who cried easily, nor one who shouted to be seen. In fact, the very thing that had earned her rejection over and over, her softness, her stillness, her too quiet nature, had become armor she wore without complaint. But that didn't mean she didn't feel it. She felt it deeply, especially now standing in a stranger's barn, clutching a worn carpet bag, and the crumpled letter that had summoned her across the country, only to be discarded like yesterday's bread. "You didn't say you were so quiet," the man had said, grimacing. "How can a man build a life with a woman who don't speak her mind?" He hadn't waited for a reply. He hadn't wanted one. Clara had stepped back onto the muddy road of Dust Creek, Wyoming, her boots soaked through her pride in tatters, and the whispers of other mail-order brides still echoing in her mind, stories of happy endings, fresh starts, and kind hands. But those women weren't her. She wasn't young, she wasn't flirtatious, and she wasn't loud. She was a woman who had spent most of her life being useful. First as a daughter, then as a caretaker, then as a seamstress, always working, always dependable. Yet somehow, in a world that praised industry, she had been branded too invisible for affection. Too shy, too quiet, too forgettable. She tried not to cry as she walked the long dirt path to the edge of town, where no one waited. She reminded herself that silence had always been her safe place. But in the quiet of her heart, a question stirred. Is there anyone who might hear what I've never dared say out loud? It was then, just before dusk set in, that a wagon creaked to a stop beside her. The man at the reins didn't speak. He simply offered her a hand, his eyes kind, but unreadable, his silence not empty, but shared. She didn't know it then, but this moment would be the hinge of her story. Because sometimes the people we are meant to belong to don't ask us to speak louder. They meet us in the hush and love us in the quiet. In the dry hush of Dust Creek, Texas, the world rarely listened for a woman's voice, especially not if it was soft. Claraboon had learned that long ago, back when her words first began to tremble, not from fear, but from a lifelong sense that speaking too loud would draw judgment she had no strength to weather. At 43, she carried the quiet with her, like a shawl woven from years of being overlooked, misunderstood, or worse, pitied. She had arrived in Dust Creek on a gray spring afternoon, the kind that made the wind bite a little sharper than expected. The mail-order wagon had bounced its way past a worn-out wooden sign that read, "Hope ends here," graffiti, scrawled by some bitter hand, half-faded by time. Clara had clutched her single-worn valise, tight, her eyes down, heart held together by threadbare hope. She was no stranger to rejection. Back in Ohio, she'd been a seamstress, a good one, but unmarried. Men had said she was too quiet, too peculiar, too set in her ways. But Clara had dared to dream again when she answered an ad posted by a widowed rancher in Texas, a man who claimed to want a God-fearing woman to share his home and raise his children. She thought perhaps she had finally found someone who might not mind that she spoke little, but listened well. The moment she stepped off that wagon and saw Leonard Beckett for the first time, tall, red-faced, and already drunk, despite the hour, her heart turned cold. He blinked at her as though she were a sack of flour left out in the rain. "You're not what I expected," he muttered, eyeing her full figure with disapproval. "You don't talk much." Clara shook her head slightly, too stunned to form words. He snorted. "Well, maybe that's a blessing." He turned and walked back toward the saloon, leaving her alone at the edge of the street, her valise at her feet. A boy no older than 10 came by with a mule cart, glancing at her with something between sympathy and curiosity. No one offered her a hand. No one asked her name. The boarding house took her in for a night begrudgingly after she paid with what little she had. She sat awake in the stiff bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling. 43 years old. No husband. No children. No place to return to. Was this what silence bought a woman? For the next 2 weeks, she tried to find work. Dust Creek was not kind to strangers, especially not shy, unmarried ones. She mended clothes for pennies. She kept her head down. She prayed. Then one morning, as the sun fought through a fog, Clara found a note pinned to her door. "You'll never be wanted if you never speak. Go home, ghost woman." She didn't cry. There was a numbness to sorrow she had grown used to. But that day she packed her valise again and left the boarding house, walking out past the edge of town, where the hills rose and the wind moved like a whispering presence. She didn't know where she was going, just that she couldn't stay. Not there. Not in a place that measured a woman's worth by how loud she could be or how perfectly she fit into a man's idea of usefulness. She walked until her legs gave way. She didn't hear the horse at first, only the crunch of boots approaching across the dry soil. She looked up and saw a man standing a few feet away. Tall, quiet. His eyes were soft and he said nothing. He simply pointed to her bag, then to the saddle at the back of his horse. She hesitated, then nodded. She didn't know then that this man, this stranger, with sun-worn skin and a silence as deep as her own, would become the one who finally saw her, not as a ghost, but as a woman worth loving. And he, Eli Kerrigan, could not hear her words, but he had always known how to listen. When the world called her invisible, he saw her clearly. But can silence truly speak the language of love? The ride to his ranch was wordless. Clara sat behind the quiet man's arms, clutching her valise, her cheek occasionally brushing the back of his weathered coat. He didn't turn to speak, didn't ask her name, didn't push for conversation. And strangely, that comforted her more than any polite exchange might have. The trail curved past brittle fence lines and thorny brush, and eventually opened into a wide clearing. There stood the ranch house, modest timber-framed, with a front porch worn smooth by time. A barn leaned slightly like it had secrets, and chickens pecked lazily at the dry earth. Everything about the place whispered solitude, but not sadness. It felt lived in, not abandoned. He dismounted and offered her a hand, strong and steady. As Clara took it, he pointed to himself and slowly signed the letters E-L-I against his chest. Then, drawing a circle around his mouth and throat, he shook his head softly. He couldn't hear, and he couldn't speak. A strange warmth filled her chest, like recognition of something buried, finally unearthed. Clara pressed a hand to her heart and mouthed, "Thank you." Eli gave a faint smile, then gestured her inside. The room was tidy, austere, but touched by care. A fire crackled low, and a stew bubbled on the stove. She noticed everything: the shelves arranged with quiet discipline, the curtains she suspected he'd mended himself, and the single chair facing the window, where sun fell long and gold across the floor. That evening, Clara wrote her name on a scrap of paper and handed it to him. He read it and nodded once, like he already knew. Then he poured her a cup of tea and placed bread on the table without a word. They ate in silence, but the silence was not empty. In the days that followed, she stayed. He didn't ask why she had no home to return to. He only showed her the rhythm of his days, feeding livestock, mending wire, repairing the roof. She followed gently, helping where she could, washing, cooking, tending to the hens. They worked like old hands in a dance that needed no rehearsal. One evening after supper, she found a slate and chalk tucked behind a cupboard. She wrote, "You don't seem to mind that I'm quiet." Eli looked at her, took the chalk, and wrote beneath her line, "I hear better when it's quiet." She laughed, a soft, startled sound. He smiled more fully this time. In his presence, she was not a shadow or an inconvenience. She was simply Clara. Still, the town's rejection haunted her. The cruel note. The weight of being discarded like an object returned unopened. Her heart kept its guard even as her hands grew at home in Eli's world. One morning, as they dug potatoes side by side, he reached for her wrist gently and pointed to the horizon. A storm was brewing, wind gathering in distant shadows, but in his eyes there was no fear, only the question, would she stay when it came? He couldn't hear the world, and she had learned not to speak to it, but together they were building something unsaid, until the past returned to knock at her door. Clara had always believed she was too quiet for the world, but now she was beginning to wonder if the world had simply been too loud to hear someone like her. She woke earlier each morning, now her hands instinctively gathering water from the pump, kneading dough for the fire-warmed oven, brushing dust from the windowsills before the sun fully lit the floor. Her movements blended into Eli's quiet rhythm, silent gestures, steady work, shared glances. It was a language all its own. Yet deep inside, something trembled. It started with a letter. One morning, as Clara returned from gathering eggs, she found a small envelope on the porch rail. Dust Creek's postman must have slipped it there while they were in the barn. Her heart skipped as she read the scrawl across the front. It was from Leonard Beckett, the man who'd rejected her, the man who'd looked her over like cattle too fat to slaughter. She didn't want to open it, but she did. "Clara, word around town is you've gone off to hide with the mute rancher up the hills. Reckon I was too quick to judge. If you're still of a mind to marry, I'm offering again. I got a place for you now. You were always a good, quiet type. Might suit me better than I thought." Come back and we'll talk proper. No apology. No mention of how he left her standing alone humiliated. Just a summons. An insult disguised as invitation. Clara read the words twice, then folded the letter with hands that shook. Her first instinct was shame, a reflex of survival etched deep into her middle-aged bones. But then she felt anger. Not the loud, fiery kind. The quiet, resolute kind that built from years of swallowing pain. She didn't tell Eli right away. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she didn't yet trust the part of herself that longed to believe someone could want her for more than what she could provide. That night, Eli gestured toward the porch. They sat side by side as the dusk turned the field silver. He handed her the slate again, tapping it gently. Sad, he wrote. Clara paused, then answered honestly. A man who once rejected me wants me now. He read it, nodded, then took the slate. Because he sees what I see. She stared at the words for a long time. What did Eli see? He didn't write again. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a tiny carving, a horse smooth and rounded, hand-whittled from pine. He placed it in her palm. Clara closed her fingers around it. It wasn't a ring. It wasn't a promise. But it was something. Something gentle. Something real. Still, sleep did not come easily that night. Clara lay awake, wondering why the letter had shaken her so deeply. She knew what Leonard had done. She knew he didn't deserve her. And yet, the echoes of rejection have a way of lingering long after logic clears the room. What if Eli changed his mind too? What if even kindness like his could fade? She had spent decades learning how to live without needing, but now she was beginning to hope. And hope is the most dangerous thing of all for a woman who has only known survival. She thought her silence protected her, but when the past came, knocking, would she have the courage to speak her truth? The next morning dawned overcast and restless, with clouds gathering low on the ridges like unshed tears. Clara awoke not to the warmth of sunlight, but to the silence pressing heavy against her ribs. The letter from Leonard still sat folded in the small drawer beside her bed, and though she hadn't opened it again, its weight clung to her like a second skin. She stepped outside to find Eli already mending a fence post, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, quiet as always. But today she didn't go to him. Not yet. Instead, she walked past the coop, past the barn, up the hill, behind the house where the grass grew wild and the breeze didn't ask questions. She needed to breathe without the fear of being looked at, weighed, judged. At 43, she had survived many kinds of silence, the kind after a blow, the kind after a rejection, the kind that settled into the bones when a girl learned she was too much or too little at once. She had worn humility like armor, but it had also become a cage. And Eli had seen her without asking her to explain. She sat under a tree and took out her own slate. The one she kept hidden in her apron meant only for thoughts too delicate to say aloud. She wrote, "He threw me away. Now he wants me because someone else picked me up." She hesitated, then added beneath, "Am I worth more because someone finally saw it, or was I always worth more?" Tears slipped down her cheeks. It was the first time in years she cried without shame. That evening, she handed the slate to Eli. He read it slowly, then carefully took his own slate. "You were always worth more. I just happened to be the one lucky enough to see it first." Clara blinked, startled by the words. He stood, then walked a few paces toward the open barn, then turned and motioned for her to follow. Inside, under a drop cloth, sat something unfinished, an old wagon he'd been quietly restoring. But on its side, carved delicately into the wood, were initials, CB plus EC. She covered her mouth. He tapped the carving, then pointed to his chest. His hands moved deliberately. "You are not quiet to me. I hear you always." It was the closest thing to a love confession Clara had ever known. And it didn't come with flowers or apologies. It came with wood and sweat and time. It came in the language she understood best, gentle deeds and unspoken loyalty. That night, Clara returned to her room and took out Leonard's letter. Without flinching, she tore it in half. Then again. Then once more. She fed it to the fire. And as the flame consumed each cruel word, something else ignited in her heart. Not anger, not revenge. Freedom. In the arms of a man who never needed her to speak, she finally found the courage to answer the world's rejection with quiet defiance. But would peace last when others came searching for what they'd lost? A week passed. Then another. Clara and Eli fell into rhythm, not the kind born from survival, but one stitched gently from intention. She no longer tiptoed around the edges of her own life, no longer flinched at every unexpected knock or sidelong glance. Here in this weathered home nestled between quiet hills, she was not too much. She was not too little. She was just enough. They began to build a garden, turning the frozen, stubborn soil by hand. Eli carved raised beds. Clara planted seedlings. They didn't talk about the future with words, but it lived in every row they dug, every seed buried with hope. At night, she would leave the window open, letting the wind carry scents of pine and prairie dust through the room. She slept deeply now, no longer curling herself into corners like a forgotten thing. Then one morning a rider came. Not the postman, not a neighbor, a stranger. He was lean, sharp-jawed, dressed in town black and dust. Clara stood on the porch while Eli tightened the reins on the fence gate, his eyes narrowing. "Name's Beckett," the man said, removing his hat. "Come to collect something that's mine." Clara's spine went cold. She didn't need to hear more. Leonard had sent his brother. Eli stepped forward before the man could even reach the porch. "She's not a thing," Clara said. It was the first time she'd spoken in front of someone else in months. Her voice cracked like an old gate, but it held. The man looked between them. "My brother says he had an agreement with the girl. Marriage, legal-like." "She's not a girl," Eli said, stepping protectively closer. "And he had an agreement with his ego, not with her." The stranger scoffed, turning back to Clara. "You ran off and hid with a mute. You think that's living?" Clara straightened. Her hands no longer shook. "It's the first time I felt seen. That's more than your brother ever gave me." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Eli placed a hand lightly on her back. She didn't flinch. "I won't be coming back," she added. "There's nothing for me there." For a moment, the stranger looked almost amused. "He's not gonna like that." Clara stepped down from the porch. "Then let him feel what it's like to be rejected." The man left, grumbling, spurs clicking like an afterthought. That night, the silence between Clara and Eli wasn't filled with doubt. It was soft, sacred. He handed her a slate with just 2 words. "Stay here." She took the slate, stared at it for a long breath, then picked up the chalk. "I already have." The world that once cast her aside had come knocking, but this time Clara stood tall in the doorway, not waiting to be chosen, but choosing herself. The days after Beckett's visit passed with a different sort of quiet. Not the anxious kind that tiptoed around confrontation, but the kind that lingers after a storm, when you stand among broken branches and realize the sky is still above you, and you're still breathing. But peace doesn't come without scars. Word had traveled fast. At church the following Sunday, Clara walked beside Eli down the aisle of Dust Creek's small chapel. The sanctuary was silent, not in reverence, but in judgment. Eyes followed her like shadows. The pastor offered only a brief nod, and the pews barely parted. Someone whispered she was supposed to marry Leonard Thompson, ran off with a deaf rancher. Clara heard it. Eli didn't. But she reached for his hand and held it, letting them all see. Because it wasn't just about rejection anymore. It was about defiance. At the store, the seamstress who once measured her for a wedding dress looked away. At the feed store, they raised prices on Eli's account. Clara offered to stop coming to town, but Eli only shook his head. He signed, "You won't disappear again. Not for them." That night, while boiling water for tea, Clara asked him, really asked, if he understood what it meant to be hated for someone else's shame. He reached for her slate and wrote slowly. "I've lived my whole life with people speaking over me around me. But you speak to me, even without sound." She felt her throat catch. After all these years, after every man who saw her sighs first and her silence second, here was someone who read the spaces between her sighs like scripture. That week, Eli carved a rocking chair from old oak and placed it beside hers on the porch. 2 chairs, side by side, like punctuation marks to a sentence no one else could write. The townsfolk could whisper, "Let them." The garden bloomed despite the frost. The fence stayed mended. The sun still rose. But something inside Clara began to shift. Not just healing, ownership. Of her story, her silence, her strength. She no longer needed to prove her worth. She simply was. In a world eager to erase the forgotten, Clara found power in being seen without spectacle and loved without condition. But could even quiet love withstand the final storm? The harvest moon hung low the night the letter arrived. Folded twice the edges, dust-worn, sealed with wax that bore the faint crest of the Thompson family. Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she held it, but her heart didn't race, not like before. She'd spent enough nights in fear. Tonight the silence was hers. She opened it in front of Eli on the porch beneath the light of 2 lanterns and 2 rocking chairs. He watched her eyes, not the paper. She read aloud, slow and clear, not because he could hear her, but because she could. "Clara, My brother tells me you've chosen to stay with the mute rancher, that you've spoken against me in public. I won't contest it. Frankly, I never intended to marry you for love. You were a name on a paper, a solution to a problem. I needed a wife. You needed a home. But it's clear now that your silence was never weakness. It unnerved me because I couldn't control it. You didn't beg. You didn't flatter. You simply existed, and I didn't know what to do with a woman who didn't shrink. Keep your peace if you found it. I won't pursue you further. Clara folded the letter slowly, the creases aligning like a quiet amen. I think she said to Eli, that's the first honest thing he's ever said to me. Eli didn't write anything back. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box carved from walnut wood. The hinges creaked like the wind. Inside a ring, simple silver, unpolished reel. Clara's breath caught. He knelt slow and steady. No audience. No preacher. Just them and the wide Wyoming sky. He didn't need words. She knew what he was asking. She took his hand. I never thought I'd be chosen after the world had dismissed me, she whispered. But here you are. He traced her name on her palm with his finger, slow and tender. Claraboon. That night, under that deep Southern Gothic sky, they made vows with no audience, no applause, just belonging. She wore no white dress. There were no flowers. But in that moment, Claraboon felt more beautiful than she ever had. Because she wasn't just loved. She was heard in the language of gestures of presence, of unwavering stillness. The town eventually adjusted. Some came around, others didn't. But Clara and Eli kept on gardening, fixing, building. Growing old, not quietly, but peacefully. And when people asked years later what happened to the too quiet mail-order bride, the answer was simple. She stayed. Because someone saw her and never looked away. If doesn't always reward the loudest voice, it honors the truest heart. Claraboon's story reminds us that even in the silence, we are still worthy. For so many, especially those in midlife and beyond the world, has made you feel overlooked, too quiet, too old, too set in your ways. But this story shows us that being too quiet can be a kind of strength, that the slowest love can be the deepest, and that even when others reject you, your dignity remains yours to carry. It is never too late to be seen for who you truly are. Eli didn't need words to recognize Clara's worth, and Clara didn't need noise to be heard. What they built was not flashy, but it was real. Their story speaks to every person who has ever felt dismissed or forgotten. So if you've ever questioned your place, if you've ever wondered whether love, purpose, or healing could still find you, this channel is for you. Subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, for stories that honor quiet strength, mature love, and second chances. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone. And don't forget to share this story with someone who needs a reminder that their time isn't over. Sometimes the right love just takes a little longer to arrive.